Engagers, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of using games and gamification in our daily lives, for example, to learn what we are teaching. And I am Rob Alvarez. I work at Ironhack, teach at IE Business School University, and so much more, and host this podcast. If you have an extra second, please go ahead and subscribe for free to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. Well, hello, Engagers. Welcome back to the Professor Game podcast. And we have Lincoln with us today. But Lincoln, we need to know before we get started, are you prepared to engage?
Sure, whatever that means.
Let's do this. We have Lincoln Stoller with us today. He's a Ph.D, CHT, CCPCPr from a family of artists and architects. He became a scientist, finding inspiration in a succession of extraordinary mentors, a Caribbean fisherman and a prophet, a tribal elder in the jungles of Panama, one physicist who invented quantum mechanics, and another who invented the laser, and a dirtbag mountaineer, to name a few. He spent a decade climbing mountains and traveling the world, 15 years as a physicist and astronomer in California, Massachusetts, and Texas, and 20 years as a software architect in New York. So you can see it's a pretty open, different things getting done. And he began exploring altered states 50 years ago with psychedelics, 25 years ago in therapy, 15 years ago when he developed and offered brain training protocols. And he's now a hypnotherapist, neuropsychotherapist, and certified clinical counselor, author, and educator. And he has a remote practice based in British Columbia in Canada. And he's using the tools he has collected, where he combines things like somatic learning, scientific theory, and consciousness, and helps people understand the reality that they create. Because he is independent, he doubts everything, and insists on finding a comprehensive, personal understanding. He supports clients in reinventing, and it can happen quickly. And he feels that you can accomplish anything using your mind, depending on your abilities to focus, perceive, create, integrate, and understand. Leave footprints, make waves. That's a phrase from Lincoln. Lincoln, are we missing anything that you want to make sure we mention before we take off?
No, you've already said too much.
So let's get to this, Lincoln. You mentioned you have a remote practice. What does that look like? What do you do, in your regular day-to-day, week-to-week? I don't know. We want to sort of be there with you and feel, what does it feel to be Lincoln for a little bit?
Oh, no, you don't want to be me. You don't know what it's like to be me. As Peter Lorre said. It's changing a lot because the internet is changing the way people work together. And it's two things are happening now. There seems to be a surge in need for mental health care. I think that's just reflecting tensions in the world and local tensions in our countries. And there is I don't know if you'd call it a surge, but a great opportunity to work remotely. So I find that I spend most of my thought time, well, a good part of it anyway, in doing outreach and trying to convince people to communicate remotely or verbally through video connections or even in written form. The internet is funny in that it facilitates the communication of people at the same time that it kind of debases a lot of more serious communication. So as a person trying to do therapy or helping people therapeutically, I'm trying to both engage them and deepen the connection. So this is what I'm working on, how to do that. I get a lot of listeners. I don't get a lot of talkers. And that's what I'm trying to do. Because as a therapist, I listen, you talk. That's how it works. Because the only answers really come from you. So I write a lot and I blog a lot, and I have a free blog. You can sign up. Maybe talk about that later. And the gaming and the teaching are sort of, they don't appear primary. They don't appear primary, but they are. I've written a lot about learning and teaching and schooling and education. And games are, well, when I started designing games, they weren't popular as learning tools. In fact, when I was a kid, games weren't very sophisticated. The arising of serious games was fairly slow. Maybe it didn't start until what's called German games. I don't know what the right name is, but these.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the German board gaming strategy with
And
games
the
like,
internet, of course, multi-user
of course.
playing games, role-playing games. So that's changed. And I think that's really a much more dynamic, well, you'd know because you're in it, but most people don't appreciate its seriousness. And maybe that's what we'll talk about. So I'm not really advocating games to my therapy clients. I mean, because most people would consider it demeaning in some ways. But I look at everything in a game-like way. And I don't mean trivial, you'll understand. I mean moving from goal to goal. And I'm not going to say too much more about it because there's so many directions we can go. I want to let you guide it a little bit.
Sure. So you mentioned that you do have sort of a game-like approach, or what you feel is a game-like approach. And I'm sure you've had a lot of experience and different ways of approaching it and different, results as well. So talking about results, when having these gameful approaches, have you had a time, or I'm sure you've had a time, but give us a story about a time where, you were trying to use this gameful approach and something went wrong. It didn't go the way you were expecting it. We want to sort of be there with you in that story, live that story with you, and, get some of the lessons learned that you got from that, perhaps.
I'll have to give you a few stories. They'll all be short because the stories are too long. The first game was school, how to make school rewarding. And I felt that was a total failure. That's why I don't believe in school, because it's compulsory for the most part. Compulsory government education is not really education. It's just training. And, we really know that. We call it preparation for, economic viability or something. And most people don't want to be there. And most of the teachers, they're not really teaching at their best. So that game was frustrating. It was like a game in which you always lose, it seems. So it didn't get better for me until I started mountain climbing, which I started as rock climbing as a teenager. I was 13. And that's a very game-like pursuit because it's got a goal, it's got obstacles. It's a bit more like a puzzle than a strategic game because you are moving through territory you don't know until you get there. And I liked that. It was very, in the case of a good, clean rock climb on a nice, warm day, everything is what's in front of you. And if you know the grade of difficulty of the climb you're on, you could be pretty sure that it's within your realm of achievement, which is interesting because games are often presented at different levels of difficulty that you have to choose or you hear about. And there's a similar reaction. You play a game and you expect to win ultimately. You expect a certain amount of resistance, but you don't expect to be defeated. And when I say defeated, I don't mean you don't lose the game. It's that you don't fail at playing it. You win or lose, but you play it effectively. In climbing, you would expect the same. You don't want to be defeated. You may have to think about it. Ultimately, you want to prevail. So that was very rewarding for me because I could pick my challenge. It was, somatically meaningful. It had a real danger, not contrived danger. And you made real decisions that affected your future, and you took the consequences. So I like that also, and not to underplay this, but it is important that I developed strong relationships with people because you depend on each other. Ultimately, they hold the rope, they keep you safe. You discuss things with them. You're involved at the same level of risk that they are, and also the same level of reward, which is completely different from a school environment. And as I told you earlier, I'm totally against school. I used to think I had something in common with teachers. I would go to teacher conferences and talk to them. But it became clear that it was like an anarchist talking to a fascist. We really had nothing in common. So now I don't even bother talking to teachers. And when I do, I make it clear that I'm anti-teacher, I'm pro-mentor, and anti-coursework and pro-life experience. So where were we going? Oh, so rock climbing was a game. And then the interesting thing about games, well, of course, I love to think in game terms. But the interesting thing about games, and I think to me this is really important, I'm more interested in inventing the game than playing it. So I spent a lot of time inventing games. And it's a totally different thing to invent the rules than to play by them. I mean, you can imagine in the situation of a sporting event, the players are never given the authority to invent the rules. At least I can't think of any, but you could probably imagine some. And when you start inventing the rules, you become more of an explorer, somewhat like a scientist, depending on which kind of scientist you are. And now you can, I think, if you're listening, you can see the parallel between rock climbing as a sport and rock climbing as an adventure. And the same thing in my heart and mind emerged through science. So I did a PhD in physics and, figure out how many classes I had over the many years. I think there were only two teachers I thought were any good. Well, good in the sense that I enjoyed their classes. They were all good in some sense, but not necessarily positive. And the two that I liked, one I liked because he shared his joy and wanted other people to join him in the game that he found fun. And the second one I liked because he made a game of it, which we could play. It was not the kind of gamification that seems to be popular now. The way he made the course a game was he said, here's the problem. I want you all to work together to solve it. All I want from you is the number that is the answer to the problem. And you'll each give me that number. You'll have to work together to get it, or lose credit according to whether the number you give me is correct. And I don't want to hear anything else about it. Didn't want to hear how he did it. And we could go to ask him questions, but he always mumbled and we never understood what he was talking about. So we had to teach ourselves, work together, and discover what the answer was. And that's pretty much of a game. But it worked wonderfully because everyone worked together. And aside from those two guys, everybody else was teaching from the book, and it was boring and ultimately wrong. I mean, because that's the way science is. It's all ultimately wrong. And that's okay. So, in terms of failures, mountaineering has a lot of failures. And you have two choices in failing in mountaineering. Either you go home or you die.
The good thing is in mountaineering, I mean, you're talking about this, so the failure is not fatal or final, right?
No, it is.
You can recover from it.
It is often. That's part of the game.
It could be.
Not to make.
It could be, yeah.
Well, most people climb until they make that mistake. And then that's the end of their career. And that's pretty common, right? Because if you're, playing something with risk, eventually you'll draw the short straw. And it takes a lot of experience to be in a high risk situation and not take risks. But so that's another aspect of gaming. So gaming mostly is about simulations and reducing a problem to its essence. But like in the case of mountaineering, sometimes it's like Russian roulette. And you didn't know the gun was loaded, but it is. Well, it doesn't happen so much in science, but I could tell you in one case, in my dissertation, which was a new way to solve an old problem, I was hired after I got my doctorate to apply my new technique to a different problem. And it wasn't a problem I was familiar with. I knew my technique. And so I worked to apply my technique to the problem I was given and succeeded and was then told to write it up, at which point I realized that the problem I was given was wrong. So I was given the problem by my employer and I solved the problem, but the problem was wrong. And the result then was garbage. The time was wasted and my job was lost. So it didn't kill me, but it killed me professionally. So there are cases where the rules are serious. I mean, this is actually true of any job, right? If you're going to gamify a job, losing the game may mean losing your job, not just, losing points. If you're going to gamify your family, right? Or, what do you stand to lose? More than just points. Why don't you take it? Either ask me more or ask me a different question.
Sure. No, those were interesting examples. And when I was saying, about the fatal flaws, I'm sure you've made mistakes, which you have recovered from, and that's why, as you mentioned, you're still here, right? And you're answering these questions, and we're talking today on this interview.
Right, good.
So you probably have managed to hedge those risks as best as you can to the best of your ability.
Good. Thanks for reminding me. Let me talk a little bit about that because I wanted to answer that question. Mistakes I made in games I've played and how I recovered. I think that's really important to realize that if you're gamifying a situation in the larger sense, I mean, so there's a large sense and a small sense of gaming. The small sense is that you define the whole game from start to finish, the rules, the goals, and the means. And you play it through to the end and you see what happens. If you're designing the game, that's a repetitive, recursive process because there are issues of balance and fun and learning that are important. If you're playing a game, you may not have the authority to do that. So typically, we're kind of in between. If you're doing a scientific project, well, even a business project, anything that's well defined, you hope it's a game you can win if you want to think of it as a game, or you hope it's a problem you can solve. I think from a business perspective, the management is responsible for creating solvable problems. And it's not really fair if the management gives the people who work for them unsolvable problems and then blames them for not solving them, which you could say happens. But if you're doing your own research, and this is where I liked to work as a scientist, and I think where you might draw a parallel to therapy, where we're all sort of doing our own research, you have to be prepared for, well, first we'll call it exploration, but with exploration comes failure. And, failure is hard to define because if you haven't defined the game, then failing is just tuning. But after a while, how many years of tuning can you endure before you feel like you're a failure? There's a great quote from Thomas Edison who said, "I failed my way to success." So he's famous for all his successes, but he was very adamant in saying that there were 100 times more failures. And I do feel that this is the problem that's set before us. If you want to succeed, you're forced to confront a simple problem. And if you want to be significant, you're forced to confront a less easily solved problem. And the greatest, in my mind, sense of accomplishment comes from solving what are the greatest problems, which means ultimately the greatest risk. Does it mean your life? Well, it doesn't mean it's going to kill you, but it could mean that you run out of time. So how do you dance that way? Again, I'm getting back to making the game rather than playing the game. And I think I'm very involved with that. I really think, and I have a 12-year-old son who's like all other kids his age, deeply involved in playing games, mostly on the internet with multiple real players. And I'm always haranguing him to be creative. And what I find the great things that his games are doing is that they're mixing contrived problems, which everyone's taking to heart as players, and creative opportunities, which boil down to how to relate to other people successfully. And most of the things that makes the games my son plays, and I'd say most people play, interesting is their personal involvement. If you're not personally involved with a game, I'm not sure it's giving you that much. It becomes a training at some point, a
You're
simulation.
trained to get better in the game, is what you're
Yeah,
saying, I guess.
and that could be important. But the most interesting games are the ones that are not entirely that. So if you look at an athlete or a musician who's repetitively trying to do better than they did before, it is a training, but for these people, it's also personally meaningful. And as an outsider, you'd say, why is it personally meaningful? What is the point of shaving off another half a second? It seems pointless. And maybe it is pointless, but to the person playing it, it has personal meaning. If it lacks that, for example, I say this because I know there's an understory to this. Welding or any trade skill often seems to most outside people to have no personal value. But as a person who's done welding and as somebody who, might do woodwork, there's a tremendous amount of aesthetic value in it that maybe only you can see. So I've been involved in lots of craft skill based learning, which you could sort of gamify, You try in limited circumstances to create the best example of a recital or a construction, and you evaluate it afterwards. It still needs to have meaning. Otherwise, it's just rote work. So the best games are the ones that have meaning. And I think you have to put it into it, even if all the rules are there. So, like a game of chess, we know chess players are sort of odd people, right? They seem to take personal value in something that has no opportunity for creative latitude. And they find that personal value in their creative strategies or something. Who knows what? Doesn't really matter. It's every one person's to define for themselves. So I would say I was trying to get to this, but I kind of lost my way. That getting to appreciate failure and getting to appreciate skill are really important if you're going to make a game meaningful. So, for example, playing scales as a musician becomes meaningful because you can start to feel music in scales. You can start to feel lyricism, creativity, or what's called prosody, and convey feeling. And in almost any skill or trade, you can develop that. And if you can't, if it's just like working the problems at the back of the book and you don't really care, I don't actually think you learn it. Even though you may learn the skill for a while, if it's meaningful, your brain is meant to remember things that have meaning, not to remember facts that have no meaning. So if a game is played that teaches you a skill that is of no use, I think you'll lose it. So that's the problem, I would say. Not just how to prevail, but how to make meaning. And to decide when it's not meaningful and then to move on or change the game.
Sounds good. So, Lincoln, after having this conversation, going sort of deep into different perspectives from games, and as you were mentioning, sort of looking into what the meaning of the games that you're creating or thinking about have, when thinking about things in this perspective again, would you say that there's some sort of, I don't know, I want to call it best practice, definitely not a silver bullet, something that would at least help you have this perspective or get this perspective closer to being right? I don't know the first time, but at least an attempt. Like, would you say there's something that you could do to make it easier, to make it better, perhaps?
I think it involves a contradiction. The contradiction is that the best way to learn the skill is to do it all wrong. That is to say, to find all the wrong ways to do it. I don't think you really master something until you understand all the ways to err. I had a teacher who said, don't try to get 100% on your test. Try to get a 0. It's much harder. Try to get an absolute 0. And, they've told you how to answer the questions. So if you just memorize what you're told and repeat it, you'll get 100. But they haven't told you what constitutes the wrong answer. So his approach was, you have much more to learn by understanding what people don't want to hear than by just repeating back to them what they do. And, this is a personal example. I've spent a lot of time with pilots. Pilots are a very rigid-minded people. There's so many rules and so many dangers and so much interaction in the air and at airports and with machines that pilots tend to be very by the book, and they have a lot of books to go by. And I'm not a very by the book person. So we didn't get along too well. But it was really interesting, because how do you be creative, if that's the kind of person you are, in a situation that has that many rules around it? And how do you enjoy yourself? I mean, obviously there's a lot of room to explore in flying, but there are a lot of things you don't want to do. What was your question again?
So I was asking, like, from having that perspective that you're mentioning of, sort of seeing,
yes.
Sort of life through games and this kind of thing. And again, the whole, you don't want to have sort of that rigidity that you're mentioning.
Yes.
Is there, again, a best practice, something that you would say, well, do this, and I'm not going to say it's going to be perfect, but, at least it's going to be a little bit better than it would if you didn't think of it that way.
That's why I mentioned the flying there, and the errors. I think you have to explore the errors. I think Richard Feynman, who's a physicist, said, I've made every mistake, but only once. And I had to amend that by saying, it's okay to make the mistake more than once, as long as the mistakes are different. If you're learning welding, you have to learn. It's not just one thing. I mean, this is the subtlety of it. As you can imagine, a construction has many forces on it. different forces require different solutions. There isn't one weld for all solutions. There's not one, mathematical approach to one problem. And in flying, there isn't one rule that will prevail in all circumstances. In a lot of circumstances, and here's where it gets interesting, sequences of errors put you in a different place than simply one error would. So if you make, a numerical error that throws off your answer, but you did all the work right, you're in one situation. If you apply a technique that completely gives you an answer you didn't expect, you're in a different situation. So I believe that you have to be careful when you gamify things, not to constrict the situation unrealistically. So you look at chess, which is a very strict game, and you wonder how you could be creative at that. And there are answers to that. They're not in the rules, they're in the strategy and in the structure of the game over time. And if you look in, what you might be more familiar with, which is sort of popular in education these days, gamifying education, which in most cases amounts to making questions more fun, you haven't really opened the field to creative mistakes. And that's what I think what you need to do in order to learn. So the question you were asked sounded like, what's the formula for approaching a game more successfully? And I think the answer I want to give is, not only is there no formula, but any formula that you come up with is suspect, because what you want to do is not find the right way to the goal, but you want to explore all the wrong ways, which will tell you much more. Here's another example. If you're climbing a mountain and you want to get to the top, there may be a route and a best way to go about it. And if you do it, you'll get to the top and you will have learned nothing. But if you explore all the wrong ways to do it, you'll learn about avalanches and rock fall and route finding, the failure of your equipment, the limits of reliability of your partners. You'll become a much wiser person for having made all the possible mistakes. So that's what I think the game should do, is confront you with all the possible mistakes you could make. And the only thing that makes it a game is that it's less fatal than the real life. It has more focused consequences. So we could actually talk about different games, but I won't go there yet.
Sounds good. Actually, I have to agree, in especially in the fact that when you say, that you're not looking for, the right answer. It's sometimes about exploring different things that can go wrong. And when designing games for learning, I completely and fully agree that one of the things that you're looking for is helping people get those different ways of getting it wrong so that they can learn from that. Like, in the end, it's not about getting it right. It's about learning from it. And whatever that looks like, whether that has to be failure, whether that has to be, having different ways for people to explore creatively, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's many, many paths that you could take in that direction. But the main thing is that you're directing yourself towards not necessarily getting the right answers. In fact, I can say, like, there's many of the simulations I've worked on personally and professionally, that it's like the people who end up, like last in the leaderboard. And that's why I know you don't like grades. I don't like them either, at least in general terms. I don't think they fit the purpose that they were made for, almost anything usually. But I don't encourage people to grade students based on the result of the simulation for a multitude of reasons. But one of the main ones is that you're putting pressure on something that shouldn't, it should be a learning experience. It should be something about, as you were saying, maybe finding the wrong ways to do things, or what are the problems that you can face, or what are the things that can actually, not work the way that you were expecting, or simply what are the different possibilities? Like, how can this go? Like, wrong, right, whatever. But you want to test out the different things that can go. And especially, like, one of the ones that we've worked a lot were back in the day when I was working on at IE University on the publishing staff, is that we were exploring, like, especially like in economics, right? You don't have like, oh, if this situation happens, the right answer is this one. You'll literally have no idea. Like, you have to test it out. Like, there are different things that could happen. There are different answers. And even if in the simulation you sort of try to restrict it to, like, this is the event and this is what happened, what do you do? you also know that in real life, other things are happening, right? So there's not one sort of really right answer or wrong answer in that sense. Sometimes the right answer for one situation happens again in a similar fashion, and it's a wrong answer just because of the nature of economics. And that's part of what we were trying to teach, right? So, or we were trying to get people to understand more than trying to teach, because that sounds like patronizing in a way. So completely agree. I can agree more that sometimes it's more about finding what are the things that could go wrong, essentially.
Let me give you three examples
and learning from that.
of this, of what you're saying.
Sure.
One example is like a war game. In a war game, you would not learn anything if you executed a perfect strategy and it worked flawlessly. I mean, you would learn nothing except how to follow the rule or follow the plan, which may be useful in terms of how not to be distracted. But what you really want to know is how all the ways the plan could fail. Because in a real life situation, you'll be constantly making decisions, not just following the plan. You'll be dealing with the chaos of this real situation. And most real situations have an element of chaos. So in that case, training warriors involves pushing them toward failure or giving them problems that they often can't solve and putting them in extremes. Second example, flying, which I know. You would like to explore all the ways to fail, because most serious failures in flying accidents happen as a consequence of a series of small failures, slightly being distracted and then losing the plan. But it's very hard to do that, aside from an electronic simulator. It's very hard to do that in real life, because the nature of flying is that it is not forgiving. You can't sort of time out, let's do it over again. I was in particular flying gliders that don't have engines, so that every landing is considered an emergency. But even if you have an engine, there are limits to what you can get out, the trouble you can get out of. And I think that made an interesting situation, because you wanted to explore the limits of your ability, but it was dangerous to go there. Probably the most dangerous. Mountaineering's not as dangerous in the sense that you can always stop and go home or turn around or whatever. But in flying, you can't do that in many cases. And the third example is somewhat odd. It's writing, being an author. How is that a game? Well, you're trying to engage the reader and create a successful narrative. Do you have anything to learn by writing a bad novel or a bad sentence or a crappy paragraph? I'm not sure you do. There's certainly many ways to succeed. And it does help to have people tell you, oh, that you've written poorly there. But it's just a different sort of simulation. You don't actually want to produce bad books. That doesn't get you anywhere. Anyway, those are my three examples of learning through failure and how the simulation plays a different role in those cases.
Absolutely. So, Lincoln, we're running out of time, but before we take off, I wanted to make sure you had a chance to say, A, what is your favorite game? B, where we can find out more about what you're doing, about your work, whatever it is you want to sort of point us towards. And then, of course, we'll say that at least for now, it's game over.
Let me answer the third point first, since I don't want to give it too short a shrift. My website is mindstrengthbalance.com. And I have a blog, and you can sign up for it, and it's free, and it's monthly, or you can pay for weekly writings and podcasts. I'd like to get more people involved. And so that takes care of the third question. The two games or gamified situations I like the most these days are not games in the formal sense. They are therapy, which is actually pretty damn close to a game, because whatever anyone tells you as a client, you have to not believe. It's very much like a Agatha Christie mystery where you're constantly being misdirected. Therapy is a whole game of misdirection, because if people knew the answer, they wouldn't come to you. So they're doing something they don't like, and they're committed to it. So it's somewhat like a game. And I think of it like a game, which some people may not like to hear, but whatever. And the other thing is research. I like to think about problems for a long time. So the move from physics to what you might call psychology has put new questions in front of me about sort of theory of mind, how your mind works, trance, altered states, dreams, the subconscious. And I like to build models. And models are essentially games, right? Because they have a situation and a bunch of rules and some sort of goal. So I consider that as a game too. And like I say, neither of these are that well formed. You can't take them out of a box and play them till their end. They're almost endless. So those are the things I'm thinking about. And I'd even like to, in some cases, make them into games. Oh, so if you do go to my website, if you dig around under the learning tab, you'll find all my board games. I have about 30, and they're pretty strange. So if you're a gaming person, you'll appreciate looking at them.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lincoln, for, again, taking your time to be with us today, for investing your energy, your time, your lessons, your insights for the engagers, for this audience today. However, Lincoln, at least for now, and engagers for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, engagers, thank you for listening to the Professor Game podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with Lincoln. And if you have any questions that you would like to ask future guests, please go to professorgame.com/question and ask that question. When it is selected, it'll come up in a future episode and you will hear that answer coming out live, because it'll be random. The guest won't see it coming, and they'll give their best answer to it, and you'll get your answer in an episode live. And remember, before you go on to your next mission, before you click continue, remember to subscribe or follow, whatever that looks like, and it's for free using your favorite podcast app, and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.